The studio fell into a heavy silence as Jonathan Roumie leaned forward, his gaze fixed calmly but firmly on actress and talk show host Whoopi Goldberg across the panel table. The tension was so thick, it felt like the lights themselves were straining under it. This was supposed to be a polite discussion on faith, civic integrity, and constitutional principles. What followed instead would leave Whoopi visibly rattled and turn a routine broadcast into the most talked about moment of the week. Everything about the setup had favored Whoopi. The network billed the segment as a conversation about the role of religion in modern politics. Her turf. A media veteran, she'd built a career on opinionated commentary, used to sparring with guests who either backed down or played along. She entered the studio with her usual bravado, likely expecting 20 minutes of Jonathan's soft-spoken deference, maybe a few "I respect your views" comments, before she could pivot back to a punchline. What she didn't realize was that she was stepping into something her producers hadn't seen coming. A patient trap, laid with humility and precision. "Ms. Goldberg," Roumie said gently, his tone calm but laced with something sharper beneath. "You just spent 10 minutes explaining morality to me like I wandered onto the wrong set. But what you might not realize is you just made my argument better than I ever could." The camera cut to Whoopi's face. Her eyebrows twitched, lips parted, an awkward flicker of confusion. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had clashed with senators, journalists, and celebrities, but now across from her sat a man she underestimated, a devout Catholic, actor, and speaker known not for bombast, but for conviction. A man who didn't posture, who didn't yell, who simply showed up prepared and unshakable. For a split second, you could see the moment land. The moment Whoopi realized this wasn't going to be the casual takedown she expected. Her trademark smirk hesitated. In its place, discomfort. Before we dive into this explosive confrontation, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss moments like this, when integrity and preparation flip the script on arrogance and assumption. Now let's see how Jonathan Roumie, without raising his voice, completely dismantled one of the most recognizable voices in daytime television. The network's studio lights burned bright under the stage as the host opened the segment with a seemingly harmless question. How should faith influence public discourse in a pluralistic society? Nobody, least of all the millions watching at home, could have guessed they were about to witness what would later be called the Goldberg humbling, a televised masterclass in how conviction and composure could leave a media veteran speechless. Things had started routinely enough. The backstage green room buzzed with typical pre-show chatter. Whoopi arrived early, as always, slipping into a worn leather armchair like she owned the space. Assistants prepped the lighting, stylists dabbed her forehead, and she scanned through her cue cards with the kind of confidence that comes from years of unchallenged authority. She was ready to spar and certain she'd win. What she didn't know was that 2 floors up, Roumie's quiet research team, a small crew of former journalists, theologians, and legal interns, were finalizing what they jokingly called the integrity files. For nearly a month, they had combed through Whoopi Goldberg's public statements, interviews, op-eds, and video segments. They charted inconsistencies, contradictions, and rhetorical reversals. They created a database not to attack, but to hold accountable. This wasn't gotcha journalism. This was a forensic unpacking of decades of unchecked opinion. Whoopi, for her part, walked onto the set with the self-assuredness of someone who thought Roumie would play nice, that he'd thank her for raising awareness, that he'd fold under sarcasm or retreat when mocked. After all, he was an actor, not a pundit, not a lawyer. What could he possibly say? But Jonathan Roumie wasn't there to win a debate. He was there to stand for truth, and he had done his homework. He sat down across from Whoopi quietly, offering a polite smile, glancing briefly at his notes. No entourage, no noise, just presence. He knew something she didn't. He always had. The stage was now set, not for a shouting match, but for a reckoning. They had built a meticulous profile, not of scandals, but of inconsistencies. Jonathan Roumie's team had tracked Whoopi Goldberg's evolving public statements over the years, analyzing whether her shifts stemmed from conviction or convenience. Tonight, that method, grounded in respect but driven by clarity, was about to face its ultimate test. Across from Roumie sat Goldberg, a woman whose name had become almost synonymous with mainstream liberal commentary. Emmy winner, host of The View, cultural icon. Her resume was unimpeachable, at least on the surface. But behind the celebrity image was a growing concern, even among her supporters. In recent years, Whoopi's tone had grown more combative, her takes more erratic. What once felt bold now sometimes felt unmoored. Her critiques of religion had turned from thoughtful to dismissive. Her claim to moral authority no longer rested on timeless values, but on TV dominance. Privately, former co-hosts and producers whispered the same worry. Was Whoopi still rooted in principle, or just in power? Until tonight, no one had dared ask that question in public. The stakes were higher than most realize. This wasn't just a culture war spat, it was a generational reckoning. Would the seasoned media titan maintain her intellectual high ground? Or would the quietly prepared newcomer dismantle her assumptions? The host seated between them opened the segment with a vague prompt. How do we balance free expression with faith in a diverse democracy? Simple enough, but what no one knew, especially not Whoopi, was that Jonathan Roumie had spent the past week researching not just theology or law, but every single public claim Goldberg had made about religion, conscience, and civic values for over 2 decades. And he had found something, several things, that would change everything. Whoopi started strong as expected. Her voice carried the practiced cadence of someone who'd spoken to millions. You know, we've got folks out there who use religion as a shield to avoid responsibility. That's not faith, that's manipulation. She didn't look at Roumie directly, but the implication was clear. The camera panned to him. No flinch, no grimace, just that subtle, familiar smile. A man who had heard the critique before and come prepared. The trap was set, and Goldberg, unaware, stepped into it, thinking she was leading the way. What unfolded next would be studied not in law school, but in media ethics, rhetoric, and moral discourse. Goldberg, emboldened by what she misread as Roumie's politeness, shifted into lecture mode. Her posture stiffened, her hands clasped like a judge behind the desk, her tone, condescending, polished, used to applause. You see, she began, what we have now are people quoting scripture when it suits them. They wrap themselves in God to shut down conversations. I've been in this business a long time, Jonathan, and let me tell you something. Those tactics don't belong in modern politics. There it was, the dismissiveness, the arrogance of assumed authority. It wasn't new for her, but tonight she was sitting across from someone who had spent years living the very values she casually attacked. What she didn't realize, what her audience didn't realize, was that Roumie had spent weeks preparing for this precise moment. Not with slogans, but with receipts. Not with rage, but with restraint. He didn't interrupt. He waited, letting her go further, letting her expose her own inconsistencies. Then she leaned in. Jonathan, with all due respect, actors shouldn't act like theologians. You're quoting things out of context. Maybe spend more time reading history and less time playing saints. The room tensed. The audience, half fans, half observers, shuffled in their seats. Even the host's eyebrows lifted. But Roumie didn't blink. He had hoped she would say something like that. Why? Because he'd seen the pattern. When Whoopi felt challenged, she lashed out. She used sarcasm as armor, credentials as a shield. But truth doesn't need armor. And tonight, it didn't need a podium either. It just needed a man who was ready. And Jonathan Roumie was ready. The insult hung in the air like incense. Pungent, performative, and fading fast. Camera operators zoomed in, sensing a shift in energy. Whoopi Goldberg, arms crossed, looked pleased with her latest jab. A confident smirk stretched across her face like a victory flag. But Jonathan Roumie? He didn't flinch. His expression was serene, even warm. The corners of his mouth curled in a knowing smile. Not of arrogance, but of quiet certainty. He knew something she didn't, and she had just walked into it. The contrast was cinematic. The aging entertainer trading on reputation and sound bites, and the humble guest, unshaken, who had come not with a script, but with truth. The host, momentarily startled, seized the moment. Mr. Roumie, he said, turning toward him, how do you respond to Ms. Goldberg's claim that your understanding of faith in public life is simplistic? This was it. Jonathan straightened slightly in his seat, not with swagger, but with purpose. He looked into the camera, letting a moment of silence settle. Then turning to Whoopi, he spoke with that unmistakable calm. Ms. Goldberg, he said gently, I do appreciate the media lesson, but respectfully, I think it's you who needs to revisit your own words. His tone didn't rise. It didn't need to. Because what you just dismissed as moral rigidity is nearly identical to the language you used, passionately, I might add, when speaking about faith-based activism just 15 years ago. Whoopi's smirk twitched. "I'm sorry, what?" she asked, half laughing, caught off guard. Roumie leaned forward now, never aggressive, just steady. "Oh, you don't remember?" he said, reaching calmly to the leather folio beside him. "Let me help." He pulled out a small tablet and tapped a few times, his hands deliberate, his posture relaxed. "I have the transcript right here. Would you like me to read it?" The air in the studio thickened. Viewers at home leaned in. The audience froze. Even the host blinked, unsure of what was about to unfold. "Wait, Jonathan," Whoopi interjected, trying to regain control. "You're cherry-picking quotes. Everyone evolves. That's not a contradiction. It's growth." But Roumie didn't take the bait. "No," he said softly. "The only thing being taken out of context tonight is your entire moral framework." He looked directly at her. "For years, you defended spiritual voices who challenged power. You celebrated their courage. You warned against the silencing of conscience. But suddenly, when those voices don't match your current politics, they become dangerous, confused, unwelcome." The accusation was gentle, but devastating. Whoopi's face began to flush. Her body shifted in her chair, arms now resting lower, less certain. Behind the cameras, producers scrambled, gesturing wildly. They knew they were no longer capturing a conversation. This was an unraveling. The control room director began switching to tighter shots. Whoopi's eyes, wide, blinking. Roumie's face, calm, unwavering. A moral reversal was happening in real time. Legal and media analysts watching from home began dialing into each other. "You watching this? This is incredible. She's unraveling. He's not even angry. That's the scary part." Social media teams at news outlets were already trimming clips before the segment ended. The footage was gold. Back on set, Roumie scrolled slowly on his tablet. "This is from your 2007 speech at the Faith and Freedom Conference," he read, voice firm but unhurried. Quote, "Silencing people of faith because they challenge your comfort zone isn't progressive. It's cowardice. A pluralistic society means protecting convictions, even when they offend your politics." The silence was deafening. Whoopi's mouth opened slightly, but no reply came. Roumie continued quietly. "And another from your 2010 interview on NPR. If religious beliefs inform someone's advocacy for justice, that's not manipulation, that's authenticity. We don't need less faith in public life. We need more humility about it." The host turned slowly toward Goldberg. "Ms. Goldberg, would you like to respond to your own statements?" Whoopi exhaled. "That was a different time," she muttered. "Different issues." Roumie paused, then gently delivered the fatal line. "So your conviction changes, depending on who's speaking it." He tilted his head slightly. "Ms. Goldberg, that's not growth, that's convenience." The room pulsed with tension. "You once said the essence of freedom is protecting unpopular truths. So here's mine. Faith doesn't become dangerous just because it's no longer fashionable. And conscience doesn't lose its power just because it doesn't fit your script." That was the moment. No shouting, no insult, just truth. And it landed like a stone in still water, rippling through every corner of the studio. The panelist who began the segment expecting to dominate had just been undone. Not by aggression, but by preparation, consistency, and courage. Roumie sat back quietly, hands folded. And Whoopi Goldberg, for once, had nothing to say. The camera caught Whoopi Goldberg's face the instant it happened. The realization that she had walked straight into the trap she didn't even know was there. Her practiced charisma, her sharp-tongued confidence, her decades of talk show command, none of it was helping her now. Her go-to rhetorical tools had failed her at the very moment she needed them most. But Jonathan Roumie wasn't done. He had been building to this moment, calmly, methodically, even gently. And now he delivered the final blow. "You say I misunderstand the role of faith in public life?" Roumie said, his voice still measured. "Then let's talk about your recent claim that religious conscience should never interfere with private business decisions. Because Ms. Goldberg, just 12 years ago, you argued the exact opposite." He looked up from his tablet, his eyes focused with divine intensity. "Those are your words, not mine. So please help us understand, when did moral conviction become optional for you?" The studio froze. The question didn't just sting, it resonated. It wasn't a gotcha. It was a call to conscience. Audience members, some of whom had grown up watching Whoopi, were now shifting in their seats, whispering. Media critics in the back were already texting colleagues. "He caught her," with her own words. That's out of context," Whoopi muttered, trying to regroup. Those were different issues. Roumie tilted his head slightly, not with sarcasm, but with grace. Different issues? Or different audiences? Then he read aloud. This is from your 2011 book, he said. When we deny people the right to act on their deepest moral beliefs in the public sphere, we are not preserving freedom. We are hollowing it out. The silence was thick and sacred. He turned another page. In your 2014 interview on NPR, it's not enough to say you believe something. Real courage is standing for it, even when it's unpopular, especially then. Whoopi looked stricken, eyes wide, lips parted. Her voice, so often commanding, was suddenly nowhere to be found. The host, sensing the magnitude, tried to steer the conversation back. Mrs. Goldberg, would you like to respond? She tried. Look, people evolve. We grow. Roumie nodded. Absolutely. Growth is good, but abandoning your own moral foundations to fit the moment, that's not growth, that's compromise. His voice dropped to a near whisper, soft but piercing. You accuse me of moral simplification, but what I see here is someone who simplified her own values until they were no longer recognizable. The room erupted, not in applause, but in stunned silence, in hushed gasps. This wasn't a debate anymore. It was a reckoning. The same woman who had once scolded others for moral hypocrisy now sat pale and wordless, brought low not by theatrics, but by truth, delivered with devastating calm by a man who had simply done the work. The host turned one last time. Mr. Goldberg, final response? Whoopi opened her mouth, then closed it. Her eyes bounced between the host and Roumie, her hands fidgeting with her pen. For the first time in perhaps her entire career, Whoopi Goldberg had nothing to say. And the silence, oh, the silence, it said everything. Roumie folded his hands, his eyes steady, his demeanor untouched. He didn't gloat, he didn't smirk, he just waited. The camera operators, trained to catch political drama, zoomed in on both faces. Goldberg, confused and defeated. Roumie, composed and luminous with conviction. The reversal was total. The talk show veteran, once the teacher, was now the exposed student. The so-called actor was now the master. And the message was clear. Integrity is not a performance. He turned toward the camera, now addressing the millions watching at home. What we need are public figures who stand by their words, not just when it's convenient, but when it costs them something. Truth shouldn't be seasonal, and conviction should never come with an expiration date. The devastation was complete. In under 20 minutes, Jonathan Roumie had done what critics, columnists, and co-hosts hadn't managed in decades. He had held Whoopi Goldberg accountable with nothing more than her own words and an unwavering moral spine. As the cameras cut, the studio exploded. Not with noise, but with movement. Producers were on their phones. Social media teams were already cutting highlight reels. Had Whoopi Exposed was trending before Roumie even left his chair. Clips of the confrontation were spreading like wildfire. But the real story wasn't just the moment. It was what came after. Journalists, professors, and everyday viewers alike began asking hard questions. Was this just about Whoopi? Or had the entertainment political elite become too comfortable dismissing faith, flipping views, and calling it growth? Within hours, YouTube compilations surfaced. Jonathan Roumie's calm destruction of media hypocrisy. Silence is the loudest answer. Whoopi has nothing to say. Faith meets fire and wins, law professors, faith leaders, columnists. Everyone was talking, not just about the confrontation, but about what it meant. And Roumie? He walked off that stage with nothing but a folder and a quiet peace. Liberal commentators and faith-centered academics, many of whom had once tiptoed around Whoopi Goldberg's contradictions, were suddenly emboldened. For years, it had felt almost taboo to challenge her authority, but that taboo shattered. Now theology professors, pastors, and students across the country were sharing the clip, using it not just as proof that no figure is too big to be held accountable, but as a case study in how to do it right. CNN's own post-show coverage confirmed what millions had already sensed. I've moderated hundreds of panels, the host admitted, visibly stunned, but I've never seen anyone walk into a studio as calm and prepared as Jonathan Roumie did tonight. He didn't just bring beliefs, he brought documentation. Indeed, Roumie's performance had become a story in itself. It was revealed that his small, tight-knit team, made up of faith-based researchers and former speechwriters, had spent weeks analyzing Whoopi Goldberg's public statements, interviews, books, and even casual sound bites. They weren't preparing for a talking point, they were building a case. And when the moment came, He delivered it not with fury, but with focus. "This is what real accountability looks like," Roumie said in a quiet follow-up interview the next morning. "She wanted to dismiss me with rhetoric, but she forgot. I've spent my life studying truth, not just quoting it, living it, and truth doesn't tremble when confronted with celebrity." The impact on Goldberg herself was immediate and devastating. Scheduled appearances on talk shows were quietly canceled. A planned book tour was postponed indefinitely, and the steady stream of opinion segments she had once commanded dried up. Media Twitter was brutal. Watching Whoopi try to explain away her own words was like watching a masterclass in rhetorical self-destruction, one analyst wrote. Another added, "Jonathan Roumie didn't attack her. He simply showed her to herself, and the mirror was unforgiving." But the most unexpected response came from her own backyard. Students at NYU and Columbia, where Whoopi had often been cited in media ethics courses, organized viewing parties. The irony was rich. At institutions where Goldberg's legacy had once stood as untouchable, students now watched the footage on loop, analyzing Roumie's delivery, his patience, and most of all his method, the use of her own words against her. At other universities, communications and theology professors began assigning the segment in class. "Watch closely," one professor instructed. "This isn't just a media takedown, it's a masterclass in principled confrontation." Blog posts, think pieces, and even seminary podcasts echoed a shared sentiment. Jonathan Roumie showed us that reverence for truth requires courage, not credentials. He didn't destroy Whoopi Goldberg. He dismantled the illusion that public authority is the same as moral authority. The generational impact was immediate and undeniable. For decades, cultural figures like Goldberg had operated with an assumption that their longevity, their awards, their headlines would shield them from real scrutiny. But Roumie had changed that. He hadn't shouted, he hadn't attacked, he had simply refused to flinch. Armed with truth, clarity, and a record of contradiction she could not escape. The message to the next generation was clear. Preparation beats persona, every time. Progressive Christian circles that had long felt ignored by mainstream media suddenly had a champion, someone who wasn't afraid to bring both faith and reason to the table. Meanwhile, media personalities on the right, who had often praised Goldberg's recent commentary, fell silent. There was nothing to say. Roumie hadn't caught her in a scandal. He had simply shown that her own words could not stand next to each other without collapsing. The silence from both extremes was telling, and faith-based organizations quickly moved to seize the moment. "This is what moral clarity looks like," tweeted one national youth pastor. "Not performance, not applause, just truth, delivered without fear." Donations to grassroots causes mentioning Roumie's name surged. Public polling showed his favorability among young adults and faith-based professionals had climbed sharply. But more than popularity, he had inspired a template. Political consultants, nonprofit leaders, even media trainers began reaching out, asking his team, "How did you prepare him? How did he stay that composed? Can we learn that method?" Because it wasn't just a victory, it was a paradigm shift. For years, we had told ourselves that experts and icons deserved deference, that they had earned the right to speak unchallenged. But now, the nation had witnessed something different. Jonathan Roumie had shown us that consistency, not celebrity, is the mark of credibility. As one political scientist at Princeton wrote, "The age of unchecked authority is over. You don't get to contradict yourself for 20 years and expect the public to look away." Jonathan Roumie just raised the bar and reset the rules. A week after the confrontation, Whoopi Goldberg released a lengthy editorial in a prominent magazine, her attempt to reclaim control of the narrative. The piece was supposed to clarify her evolving stance on faith in public discourse. Instead, it read like a defensive spiral, more excuse than explanation. She didn't address the contradictions Jonathan Roumie had exposed. She didn't reconcile her old positions with her new ones. She simply repackaged them, hoping the audience wouldn't notice the seams. But they did. Faith leaders, theologians, and media analysts called it out immediately. She didn't explain anything, one seminary professor tweeted. She just doubled down. If your response to being caught in contradictions is to write more contradictions, you've missed the point entirely. That tweet from a Yale divinity scholar went viral. Within hours, academic circles were ablaze. #Whoopi response trended nationwide. What was meant to be a recovery became a second collapse. Her essay wasn't a reflection, it was a deflection. And it confirmed what Roumie had calmly revealed, that when truth becomes inconvenient, some choose to hide behind verbosity. Commentators noted that this second wave of backlash was almost as damaging as the original debate, because it wasn't just about opinion anymore. It was about intellectual integrity. As law schools had added Jasmine Crockett's original confrontation to their curricula, now communications departments and theology schools were adding Roumie's strategy to theirs. In one widely shared media studies assignment titled The Roumie Method, Calm, Consistent, Crushing, students were asked to analyze how he used primary sources, how he never raised his voice, how he refused personal attacks, letting facts carry the weight, and how he gave his opponent every chance to recover until the evidence spoke louder than the rhetoric. A political science professor put it plainly, this wasn't a takedown, it was a transformation of how we debate, of how we prepare, of how we hold power accountable. But the biggest shift came in the public's imagination. Jonathan Roumie was no longer just that actor from The Chosen. He was now being described as the conscience in the room, the man who brought integrity back to the spotlight, a national voice for moral clarity. His team began receiving requests from political figures and public servants, not for endorsements, but for training. How did you prepare? What did your research team build? Can we replicate it? Even nonprofit organizations and faith-based think tanks wanted to adopt what they began calling the Roumie standard: calm over clamor, facts over flair, integrity over image. And as donations to causes associated with his name surged, something deeper began to shift in the public square. Commentators from both left and right, some grudgingly, acknowledged what had just happened. One editorial in The Atlantic summed it up best. Jonathan Roumie didn't just expose Whoopi Goldberg's contradictions. He exposed a broken culture of deference, where fame outranked truth. And in doing so, he gave us something rarer than a viral clip. He gave us a model of accountability in a time of noise. Political strategists took note. Progressive organizations began floating Roumie's name, not just as a public voice, but as a possible candidate for office, or at the very least, a new standard bearer for how to engage with conviction without cruelty. He responded with his usual humility. I'm not here to win arguments. I'm here to stand for something. And if that inspires others to do the same, then I'm grateful. And as millions continued to watch and rewatch the now iconic segment, Roumie's calm stare, Goldberg's stunned silence, the final takeaway was clear. The age of automatic authority is over. The era of earned respect has begun. Jonathan Roumie didn't just win a debate. He didn't just hold a media icon accountable. He showed a generation how to think, how to prepare, and how to lead. And as the credits rolled and the view count climbed, one truth remained undeniable. Preparation beats performance. Conviction beats charisma. And in an age of noise, quiet truth still wins. If you found this masterclass encouraging, clarity inspiring, don't forget to subscribe, share, and hit that notification bell. Because the future doesn't belong to those who speak the loudest. It belongs to those who speak the truth best. And we'll be here to document every moment of that future as it unfolds.